If my clock is right, I think our session is actually just ending, right? So I can just pop back. No? I'm keenly aware that I am what is standing between you and a break, your lunch, perhaps a trip to the loo. So I will try to make my words count and to provide you with some succinct but hopefully helpful information. I want to thank our host, both Advance HE and Oxford University, for gathering us, for bringing us both online and in person. It's really, really exciting to be able to come together and to share our learning, to share our challenges, to share hopefully some solutions, to hopefully better our work and make it stronger and more effective. And so I'm really, really pleased to be here and to get to learn from all of you over the next 2 days. As Sarah said, my name is Travis York. Please feel free when you're tweeting the hashtag here to tag me. My Twitter is on the screen here as well. If you're a tweeter, I greatly appreciate it. I think it's helpful to begin here just to set the stage a little bit. I feel a little bit, and this may be an Americanism, so this may not land very well, but we have a kind of saying from an older game TV show, like, which one of these is not like the other? It's sea change. America is not like the other context here. And so when I was first asked to speak about the national funding strategy for diversity, I thought, well, that's a short presentation. There is none. There simply is none in the US. But I do think that there's actually some interesting ways to think about how funding opportunities do happen at the national level, and how does Sea Change as an initiative actually operate? Because it's not situated within the United States government. Sea Change is an initiative that we run through the association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the largest multidisciplinary science association in the world. We have about 120,000 members, primarily in North America, but also internationally. And we cover all STEM disciplines. And my shop, iSeed, doesn't focus just on higher education, but we actually think about the entire continuum of STEM education and workforce development. Formal and informal education pathways for women, persons with disabilities, sexual minoritized status, or LGBTQ plus individuals, and thinking about gender and race. And we do all of that through an intersectional lens. And in really thinking about what are the contexts that individuals in their whole selves deal with. And for me, that comes down to asking two fundamental questions. What is the experience that every person should have? And what is the experience that no person should have? And really letting those two questions guide the way we think about the structures, processes, programs that people encounter along the STEM pathways. So a little bit about the context. I think that this is fairly similar across other international stages, but for the US, you can sharply see that we actually have had increasing representation of both women and racial representation over the past several decades. However, the makeup of our student body and the makeup of our academic body have not kept in pace with each other. In fact, that gap has widened. And this is not to say that there haven't been initiatives throughout the US. In fact, there have been decades and millions of dollars pumped into the STEM education pathway, or what many people call actually a pipeline, to try to make STEM more inclusive in the US. National Science Foundation, a governmental agency, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, Department of Defense have sunk considerable investments to try to make the US workforce more representative. Why hasn't that worked? You can see here in this graph, although the complementary lines actually are not showing up too well in the slide, at least here, might be showing up better for those of you virtually, but there's a mismatch between actual representation of the population and of the science and engineering workforce. And so we have this persistent problem. And the context of the American higher education system is a little bit on a different scale. Does anybody know by chance how many colleges and universities there are in the US, approximately? Beth, you don't count, sorry.
It's not 18.
It's not 18, I'm sorry. It's actually almost 5,000 institutions of higher education. That includes both 2 years or associate degrees and 4-year bachelor's degree, master's, and doctorate institutions. Of those 5,000, almost 3,000 are 4-year, or what we call bachelor's and above granting institutions. And of those 3,000, 1,626 are in fact publicly funded 4-year institutions. So the scale is a little bit daunting when we think about, even if a federal agency was to say, all right, you lot, equity charter plans due next year, if even just for publicly funded institutions, there'd be 1,626 institutions to monitor, to train, to build capacity in. So it presents some interesting factors, some interesting opportunities for us to think about how do we achieve the equity goals that we have set. And why hasn't the needle really moved? And I think that part of this is attributed to limiting conversations and conceptions. So oftentimes when we discuss diversity, and a lot of the conversations that I'm around, one of the things that we hear, or that I hear in particular, is that these discussions usually are identifying or focusing on an isolated challenge, usually either recruitment, hiring, or retention of faculty. And these isolated conversations oftentimes lead to individual programmatic interventions, and they're usually targeted specifically at interventions. You might have a program that's around cluster hires or trying to help individuals navigate these pathways better. And I think that's actually partly to blame to a previous conception, especially in STEM, of the leaky pipeline. And we think about ways that we can help the water traverse that leaky pipeline better, which makes no sense, right? We don't call a plumber to fix the water, we call a plumber to fix the pipes. But these individual programs are really trying to help people navigate those capacities instead of fixing the structures themselves. Another issue that we run into here is that these challenges are often assumed to be due to individual will or choice, that individuals are just simply choosing to go into other fields, or they're just not interested. You know, women or minorities may just not be as interested in STEM, even though we know from early education research that is simply false, completely false. So what are other limiting factors? Oh, there we go. The other thing here is, and I'll use fascinating here as a diplomatic term. The US has a fascinating and interesting policy landscape when it comes to education, which is why there is not a formal, or which is embedded in this idea that education is not a right guaranteed in the United States Constitution or Bill of Rights. Education is not something that all Americans are guaranteed. And so in particular, when it comes to higher education, it's led to an interesting policy landscape. At the federal level, we really only have two primary mechanisms. Tom, I'll give you a $5 later. Thank you for setting this up. I had to submit these slides a week ahead of time. I promised there was no collusion. Really, we only have carrots and sticks to affect or catalyze change. And really, the sticks are just the taking away of carrots. They're not really sticks in and of themselves in the US context. The primary stick that the federal government has is to limit the use of student financial aid for institutions that aren't in some sort of compliance. So for instance, some of you may have heard the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, or Title IX. In the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, which was started in the 1960s, it created federal student financial aid, which is the primary source, especially for low-income or first-generation students, to enter the higher ed system. Institutions, that money flows directly to students. Students carry that money with them, their eligibility to some financial aid, right? Well, if an institution is out of compliance, say with a Title IX or gender equity complaint, the federal government, the Department of Education, can say, students who choose to go to your institution will not be able to carry their financial aid dollars. Of course, that would be detrimental to most institutions, especially if they're publicly funded. So those students wouldn't be able to bring their aid pocket with them to that institution. So that's the removal, really, of a carrot in the form of financial aid. This is further complicated by the fact that there is an absence of a student-level record system in the US. In 2008, a congressional, Virginia Fox, proposed and had accepted into legislation that it would be illegal for the United States government, specifically the Department of Education in the US, to collect student-level data for issues of privacy. There was a large concern over the privacy of data, big data sets. And so unlike many of the incredible higher education systems that you all are part of, we do not have a student-level tracking system where we can see where certain student groups are not served or are pushed out of the STEM pathways. So there are some other ways that we try to get at this. We can do some survey data. We do have some federal agencies that do sampling, but as many of you are scientists in the room, especially those of you who are fellow social scientists, you know all the problems that come along with survey, especially survey sampling, and especially when we're talking about inclusive and equitable survey sampling. And so we run into all of those layered complications in really understanding where people are or are not served in the STEM pathways in the US. I don't want to leave you thinking in complete despair of the US. There are some interesting funding opportunity windows, and we do have a really great program that I'll self-servingly call fantastic, named SeaChange. You might have heard of it. My office runs it. It's fantastic. It was started in 2017, as you heard, and we're actually now at 25 universities that are members of SeaChange. 26, thank you, Beth. That's right, we had another one join just this past month. So 26 universities have joined our initiative. I think I see a couple of windows, and one of these windows kind of exists at the institution of higher education level. Because of the system and the complexities that we have, this means that the work that is happening at the national landscape, at the national level around DEI, is really being motivated by community members. It's by institutions, it's by industry leaders saying to their community partners, we need more diverse, more representative scientific workforce. We have to have that to maintain the greatest economic advantage that our country has, which is its diversity. And as we have shifted as a country in really starting to think about diversity as an economic advantage, one of our greatest assets, just as Tom said earlier, it shifts the conversation, not about how do we check that box or do that compliance thing, but it shifts our entire thinking to saying, how are we protecting our greatest assets? If one of our greatest assets is diversity, what are we doing when the systems that we have in place are not maintaining their goal of keeping that diversity in our pathways? And so it allows us a different way of thinking about that and allows many community partners and stakeholders to come together. One example of that is SeaChange, right? SeaChange is housed and operated at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You'd think I know my own organization's name. AAAS, it's still very early for me. And so you see a disciplinary association taking up this work and working with our national partners and industry leaders. There also are many institutions that have come together and said, well, despite the fact that there is not a national data system, we will just simply decide to fix this problem ourselves. We will figure out a way to actually have the student unit record systems that we need to be able to understand the system and to optimize its performance for more equitable inclusion. There's also a window of opportunity for success around STEM associations like AAAS. On the screen here, you'll see several examples of publications that have come out from our National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. You'll see actually some recent recommendations that are specifically pointing out programs like SeaChange that should occur. This was actually in a report that was dedicated to ending sexual harassment in the STEM fields, and talking about how the #1 recommendation for doing that, for addressing sexual harassment, was in fact making more inclusive systems and cultures within institutions of higher education and the research enterprise. And then finally, another opportunity here I do think is a growing and changing policy landscape. With every new administration, we have different opportunities that present themselves. You might have heard that we have a different administration currently, and while I work with any and every administration, the current one has STEM and science holding it in a different kind of space than the previous administration. So the current administration has made science, mathematics, STEM, engineering, medicine a priority, and has sought to increase funding at record levels for those spaces. And with that funding comes opportunities for us to advance these goals as a sector. And I think that the other really interesting thing here is that there becomes an increasing opportunity for public and private partnerships. Down here at the bottom of your screen, I have a screenshot of a recent exhibit that we were very, very excited to be a part of. So AAAS, we also host a program called If Then Ambassadors, which focuses on training women scientists to be ambassadors for the next generation of scientists, in particular for girls and women. And as part of this, we have 120 ambassadors. This is a program funded by a private philanthropy, Lyda Hill Philanthropies. And in that program, we took 100% life-sized 3D printed statues. They're bright orange of every one of the 120 women scientists. It is the largest collection of women statues in the world because, spoiler alert, not many statues are of women, which is a whole different issue I'd love to talk about over a drink this evening. And we were really happy to actually exhibit this display of 120 statues at the Smithsonian Institutes all across Washington, D.C. It's also been featured in Texas. It was really, really exciting. It happened this past month. It was on display, got a lot of news coverage. But the most exciting thing for me was the number of scientists, ambassadors who were there with their daughters and their mothers and talking about the intergenerational impact of really shining a spotlight on the true diversity of STEM in this space. I think these public-private partnerships, the Smithsonian, a private funder, coming together are really continuing to drive change and impact. And I think that that's the way in the US that this work will continue to go. But I do think that there's also many other policy opportunities that we will continue to work on. AAAS will be at the White House in a couple of weeks, helping with the White House Easter egg roll, which this year will be entirely focused on STEM education for children. And so we will be featuring a broad set of scientists doing diversity demonstrations at the White House, which will be really exciting. And those sorts of representational spaces really matter to carry the work forward. So again, thank you for your extra time and patience allowing me to present today. I'm happy to chat with you more at lunch and throughout the rest of the conference, and I want to thank our hosts again.